So welcome everyone to this afternoon's Grand Challenges lecture from the Institute of Liberal Arts and Sciences, entitled The Elimination of Violence Against All Women, the Grand Challenge Facing Us Today. Briefly, for those of you who may be new to these events, ILAS is a vibrant and welcoming hub which distills Keel's long history and commitment to interdisciplinary research, teaching and learning. More information is available on the ILAS website at www.keel.ac.uk/ILAS, where you can also see videos of previous Grand Challenges lectures. Our event today is brought to you in conjunction with Keele University's various equality, diversity and inclusion groups and committees to mark the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And so it is my very great honour to introduce Pragna Patel, who will be delivering this afternoon's talk. Pragna is a founding member and director of the Advocacy and Campaigning Centre Southall Black Sisters. Established in 1979 to meet the needs of Black and minority women, the bulk of Southall Black Sisters' work is directed at assisting women and children to attain effective perfection and to assert their fundamental rights in the face of gender-based violence and related problems. Over the years, Pragna has been centrally involved in some of Southall Black Sisters' most important cases and its most salient campaigns on domestic violence, immigration and religious fundamentalism. She's also written extensively on race, gender and religion, and on the need to address the multiple and overlapping forms of discrimination that create injustice and inequality. We try to keep these introductions really short, but I'm taking the liberty here to say a little more than usual because this is perhaps a special moment. The Management Committee of Southall Black Sisters announced last week that Pragna is to stand down from the directorship in January after 30 years at the helm, and they published on the internet and via social media a really wonderful and moving tribute to her, which you can find in full on the Southall Black Sisters website. It's much too long to read out here, but I wanted to give you a very brief taste of it. The statement pays tribute to Pragna's integrity, political intellect, courage and vision, and speaks of the way in which this truly remarkable visionary, warrior, pioneer has impacted the lives of thousands of women who have been through Southall Black Sisters' doors and inspired many others to become feminist activists. It notes her dogged determination, her courage, resilience and personal magnetism, and describes her as the very embodiment of intersectional feminism, always recognising and facing down many different injustices at the same time. So we are really truly honoured to have you here with us today, and it was an enormous pleasure that I now hand over to you for the afternoon's talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm absolutely honoured and to be here. It's an absolute privilege to be back at Keele University, home from home for me, and I've been asked to deliver this lecture to mark 16 Days of Activism that begins today, the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Violence against women. But 16 days ends, 16 Days of Activism ends on 10th of December. And 10th of December is Human Rights Day. And I think it's no coincidence that we have 16 Days of Activism running from today to mark violence against women to 10th of December, Human Rights Day. I think it's no coincidence because the struggle to end violence against women and girls is inextricably linked to the struggle for human rights. The two are connected because violence against women and girls is both a cause and consequence of women's inequality and women's lack of rights. So, no one can have failed to notice that it has taken a series of horrific assaults on women and the more recent Me Too movement across the globe to raise awareness of the growing brutalization of women and widespread government inaction and failure to deliver justice. For example, in 2012, we witnessed the rape and murder of Jyoti Singh in Delhi. And in 2019, the rape and murder of the 19-year-old college student Yunene Motwana in South Africa, Pinar Gultekin in Turkey in 2020, as well as the homicides in the UK of Nicole Smallman and Biba Henry in 2020, and Sarah Everard and Sabina Nessa in 2021. When we locate these murders or femicides, as they should be known, within the wider global struggles for equality and justice waged by women, we can see that violence against women is a worldwide problem. It exists in every society and culture. As these images of recent protests show, globally, women are raped, sexually abused, and killed in such vast numbers that it constitutes, to my mind, one of the world's greatest human rights violations. This then begs the question, why, after so many years of raised awareness, development, and progress, do we continue to witness the persistence of and even increased levels of violence against women and girls everywhere? The answer is probably quite complex, but it probably also lies in the way in which economic and political developments, widening inequalities, the rise of social conservatism and religious fundamentalism, the privatization of justice and key welfare services, the lack of political will, and austerity measures all intersect with and reinforce patriarchal power. Here are some stark global statistics on violence against women and girls from the UN body for women's equality and empowerment. An estimated 736 million women, almost 1 in 3, have been subject to intimate partner violence, non-partner sexual violence, or both at least once in their lifetime. 30% of the women are age 15 and older. 137 women are killed by a member of their family every day. It is estimated that of the 87,000 women who were intentionally killed in 2017 globally, more than half, 50,000, were killed by intimate partners or family members. More than 1/3, 30,000, of the women intentionally killed were killed by their current or former intimate partner. There are estimated 5,000 honor killings a year internationally. And 71% of all human trafficking victims worldwide are women and girls. And 3 out of 4 of these women and girls are sexually exploited. More statistics. 200 million women and girls or more, aged 15 to 49 years, are estimated to have undergone female genital mutilation in 31 countries where the practice is concentrated. Half of these countries are in West Africa. Globally, 21% of young women were married before their 18th birthday. 650 million girls and women alive today were married as children. And 15 million adolescent girls worldwide, aged 15 to 19 years, have experienced forced sex. So what of the UK? Research from the Femicide Census, a UK organisation which collects information on men's violence against women, calculates that across the UK, 1,425 women were killed by men in the 10 years to 2018. That is about 1 killing every 3 days. More recently, the Office for National Statistics estimated that in the year ending March 21, 4.9 million women had been victims of sexual assault at least once in their lives. This included 1.4 million women who'd been raped or had faced attempted rape. And in total, 98.5% of the rapists were identified as men. 2020 statistics make for sobering reading. 207 women were killed in 2020 in Great Britain. That's England, Scotland, and Wales. This means that about 1 in 4 killings were of women. Sexual assault was most common amongst younger women, with about 1 in 10 women aged 16 to 24 having been a victim in the past year. 1 in 5 women had been the victim of stalking since the age of 16, twice the number of men. And 1.6 million women in England and Wales were estimated to be victims of domestic abuse. And then we look at statistics during the pandemic. It should be clear to many people, or most people will know, that the numbers of women subject to domestic or physical violence or coercive and controlling behavior had gone up considerably during the pandemic. And it led many to rightly call the crisis the shadow pandemic. The pandemic has heightened the risks that women face, especially in a context where inequality, poverty, and homelessness has risen, and where lockdown measures have made it harder for women to exit abuse. For example, as soon as the first lockdown was announced in China, reports suggested that domestic abuse had tripled in some cities. Other countries also witnessed an increase in domestic abuse reports, 40 to 50% in Brazil, 20% in Spain, 30% in Cyprus, 19% in Egypt, and 50% in Palestine. In countries such as India, the pandemic has led to other unforeseen but devastating consequences, such as a rise in child marriage, due to families making use of restrictions on people attending weddings to keep costs down. And in Haiti, natural disasters such as the earthquake in 2021 added to the difficulties and risks of domestic and sexual violence encountered by women. In the UK, as these statistics show, since the lockdowns began in March 2019, we've seen an increase in domestic abuse. Within the first 3 weeks of the first lockdown, there had been 16 domestic abuse killings of women and children, the highest for 11 years. This is consistent with data obtained by the BBC in September 2019 from 43 police forces across the United Kingdom that showed that murders as a result of domestic violence were at a 5-year high. Between April and June 2020, there was a 65% increase in calls to the National Domestic Abuse Helpline when compared to the first 3 months of that year. But these statistics don't tell the full story. What they don't tell us is that in every country, there are enduring and alarming silences surrounding the experiences of the most marginalized groups of women who remain excluded from the statistics and consequently from public discourse and from protection measures. If these women are included, they are included grudgingly, usually following protests by feminists and other human rights activists to make them more visible and the state more accountable. In India, for example, women from the so-called lower castes, such as Dalit women, once called untouchables, who make up 16% of the women in India, are raped, maimed, and killed, usually by upper caste men on a daily basis. But what makes the matter worse is that these men are also shielded by the police and even politicians who also rape the women in what are termed custodial rapes or rape by authority. There are similar silences surrounding the femicide of indigenous women in, say, Mexico, or Roma women in Europe. Their experiences hardly hit the media headlines, thus keeping them hidden from view. The silences and gaps are not just about the failure to count such women, but also about a systemic institutional failure to deliver justice to the families of these women. In the UK, nothing could have brought this home more clearly than the police and media reaction to the murder of Sarah Everard. which stood in stark contrast to how they responded to the murder of the Black women, Biba Henry and Nicole Smallman. When Sarah Everard was killed, an immediate police investigation followed, along with widespread media coverage expressing horrified outrage. An outpouring of grief led to a social media movement and instant mobilizations of women across the UK who rightly held vigils and protests against the police handling of the case and the continuing high levels of violence against women and their lack of safety. Yet the murders of Biba Henry and Nicole Smallman did not receive the same attention from the police or the media. For a start, the police did not take their mother, Mina Smallman's report that they were missing seriously, which meant that there was no immediate police search for them. The dead women's bodies were eventually found not by the police, but by friends. This same failure was seen in the police handling of another missing person report, that of Jan Mustafa, a foreign national woman who was missing for a whole year before her body was eventually found in a freezer, along with another murdered woman, Henriette Skutz, in 2019. It is now clear that the Metropolitan Police had failed Miss Smallman on multiple levels. They failed to follow their own missing person policies. They failed to carry out a thorough investigation, and they failed to treat the dead bodies of the women with any respect when they were discovered. Instead, what we witnessed was the unedifying conduct of two police officers who took selfies next to the dead women after they were discovered and shared their images on WhatsApp. In an interview, Miss Smallman said the actions of the police had taken her family's grief to another place. She also added, "If ever we needed an example of how toxic it has become, those police officers felt so safe, so untouchable, that they felt they could take photographs of dead Black girls and send them on." This is why, following an outcry about how she and her family were treated, she rejected an apology from the police, calling their response incompetent and irresponsible, and the apology hollow and shameful. It is worth contrasting what Ms. Smallman says about the police with the findings of the Independent Office for Police Conduct, which concluded that although the service the family received from the police was unacceptable and there were failings, bias was not a factor in the police response. I have to say that it is difficult to see what else but racial bias or racism led to such reprehensible police conduct. It is hard not to agree with Ms. Smallman, who maintains that the police response suggests racial profiling, misogyny, or classism. This is also echoed by the former Met Chief Superintendent Dal Babu, who told the BBC Radio 4 that he believed the police would have responded differently to the missing persons report if the sisters had been white. He said, "I have to ask if this was a 40-year-old professional white woman, in the same way that Biba Henry was a social worker, whether we would have had the delay or difficulties. Quite frankly, I don't think that would be the case." Ms. Smallman also singled out the media for criticism, stating, "It wasn't because I didn't do interviews, it was because it didn't get the airtime. It wasn't on front page." She went on to say, "When I spoke about Sarah Everard, I was not judging that family because we've been through that devastation. The only point I was making was who knew about our girls." Ms. Smallman, who is a former priest and teacher, called on people to stand up to racism and derogatory behavior towards women. "Racism is still here," she says. What these experiences highlight is how social divisions in society are not only expressed in the way that marginalized women experience discrimination in their daily lives, but also in the way that they are represented through images, texts, ideologies, and even legislation and policy itself. The outcry that followed the deaths of the Black women, particularly from other BME women, was palpable. And months later, following the murder of Sabina Nessa, a South Asian woman, an immediate women's vigil took place, and the police response to her death, at least in public, appeared more appropriate. Nevertheless, what these experiences tell us is that there are many silences and gaps in our understanding of Black and minority women's experiences of gender-related forms of abuse in the UK itself. What is worse is that we are complicit in creating such silences through the maintenance of cultures of denial and indifference and structures of inequality and subjugation. The first most obvious gap that we encounter is the lack of knowledge about the true extent of violence against women and girls in Black and minority communities. There is a complete lack of reliable statistics on Black and minority women, primarily because the data that is gathered is not disaggregated, and because the multiple forms of abuse they experience is often not recognized or is misrepresented. Not only do we not know about the prevalence of domestic and sexual violence, but we have little or no understanding of the more hidden and specific forms of abuse, such as polygamy, dowry-related abuse, marital and religious coercion and duress, domestic servitude and marriage, marital captivity, ritual forms of abuse, suicide aggravated by domestic violence, and violence in transnational spaces, including transnational marriage abandonment. The little evidence that exists suggests the following: that there are about 1,000 cases of forced marriage per year in the UK, 85% of which involve women and girls. There are 12 cases on average of honor killings per year. South Asian women, particularly those aged between 15 and 34, are up to 3 times more likely to kill themselves than women in the general population. Between 2001 and 2009, Southall Black Sisters carried out an internal sample study of users at the centre who had contemplated or attempted suicide or self-harm. The findings showed that many women had contemplated or attempted suicide at least once in their lives. Out of a total of 252 women, 62% of them had contemplated or attempted suicide and self-harm. More recently, evidence from police research on homicide during the COVID pandemic in 2020 shows that 24% of all victims of homicide were BME women, higher than previous 15-year domestic homicide average. The 2019-20 domestic homicide data and the general population. Child deaths and adult family homicides had the highest proportion of BME victims, 44% and 30% respectively. Over the last 40 years, my everyday work at Southall Black Sisters shows that the combination of internal patriarchal dynamics of coercive control, coupled with wider state failings, result in increasing levels of injustice and unequal life chances for BME women. Because they are powerless subgroups within minorities, they face simultaneous discrimination and social exclusion on multiple grounds of, for example, ethnicity, race, migrant status, gender, class, and education. This is what some also refer to as intersectional discrimination. I'd like to say a few words about intersectionality at this point, simply because the idea of intersectionality has gained considerable traction in academic and policy circles when discussing violence against women and girls, but there is also a lot of misunderstandings about it. All too often, intersectionality is reduced to simply a matter of adding a person's multiple identities in some kind of mechanical way, without sufficiently understanding or articulating how different strands of discrimination interact with each other to form experiences of disadvantage, powerlessness, and marginalization. An intersectional approach is not so much about recognizing multiple identities, but about a way of exploring how multiple and overlapping forms of structural oppression and discrimination based on class, sex, race, migrant status, age, sexual orientation, disability, and religion, for example, combine or intersect to create heightened and persistent forms of inequality and marginalization. The term was first coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, an American law professor and social theorist. The theory emerged 2 decades ago to explain the specific lived realities of Black women in the US, subject to discrimination in the workplace on account of their sex and their race. Crenshaw developed intersectional theory, stating that in order to understand their inequality of working conditions and pay, it was necessary to look at the interactions or intersections of their Blackness and womanhood, which put them at risk of discrimination and exploitation and increase their powerlessness. But significantly, intersectionality is not just a theoretical or analytical concept. It is an approach that grew out of concrete political struggles waged by Black feminists in the US that challenge, for instance, both racism and sex-based discrimination. Around the same time that the theory was being developed, Black and minority feminists in the UK began to speak out about the white middle-class nature of the second wave feminist movement. They found it difficult to identify with the issues that did not take account of the class and racial dimensions that led to unequal outcomes for some women. At the same time, many of the Black women also experienced sexism whilst participating in the anti-racist movements in which they were often shut out of leadership positions, subject to sexual harassment and silence when seeking to raise their specific experiences as Black women. Feminist campaigning organizations like South All Black Sisters developed forms of activism that involved tackling multiple forms of oppression at one and the same time without prioritizing any one particular struggle. And this gave shape to the approach that is now widely recognized as intersectional. There are different types of intersectional discrimination or subordination, but the failure to adequately analyze all experiences of intersectional discrimination lies in the fact that in traditional conceptions of race and gender discrimination, certain specific problems or forms of discrimination faced by marginalized women are rendered invisible. The women who attend South All Black Sisters Advocacy Center arrive in varying degrees of distress and vulnerability. Many challenge on a daily basis violent, abusive, and degrading practices towards them that are interrelated with other matters such as homelessness, immigration, mental health, destitution, and poverty. What their experiences tell us is that they are more likely to experience abuse from multiple perpetrators, and they are more likely to remain trapped in violent relationships for longer than white British women, due to a range of internal and external barriers that they face. For many BME women, culture and religion, and the two are often indistinguishable in reality, are formidable internal barriers that are often employed to impose and justify control over their bodies, sexuality, emotions, decisions, and actions, preventing them from expressing their own free will and from enjoying their fundamental freedoms and rights, including the right to choice in marriage and sexuality. Whilst all women experience gender-related harms within a cultural context, for some women who live in insular and tight-knit communities, the imposition of strict religious and cultural values can be experienced in more heightened forms that result in constrained choices and lack of autonomy and independence over key aspects of their lives. For example, although in most communities women feel a very strong sense of shame in disclosing violence, women from Asian and Middle Eastern backgrounds are particularly impacted by the patriarchal concepts of honor and shame. These concepts are central organizing features of family life, and as such pose a powerful obstacle to disclosure and exit from domestic and other forms of abuse and oppressive practices. Family honor in such communities rests on women's behavior, and they're expected to maintain their honor by adhering to the religious and cultural norms of their community, norms that are becoming more and not less rigid with the rise of religious fundamentalism and ultra-conservatism. Any transgression on women's part brings intense shame on their families and kinship groups and attracts immense social stigma and persecution that can also result in physical punishment and even murder in what are known as honor killings. Women are therefore unlikely to take any form of action to protect themselves unless they're confident that they can survive the stigma, isolation, and punishment that ensues for leaving a marriage or family. Their trauma, fear of revenge, lack of support, and general social isolation is so intense that many make several attempts to reconcile with abusive families or partners before they're ready to make a complete break. The high proportion of young South Asian women at risk of committing suicide, up to three times the national average, illustrates just how deeply embedded these concepts of honor and shame are in the social and psychological mindset of the communities in which they live. Female suicide is generally culturally more acceptable than leaving a marriage or family, regardless of the circumstances. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual people in certain BME communities also experience increased stigma and discrimination within their communities. The stigma can put lesbian, bisexual, and trans women under greater pressure and make them less willing to identify publicly as LBGT, thus making it harder for them to access vital services or rights. On the other hand, Black and minority women also experience considerable external barriers that can plunge them into higher rates of poverty and homelessness and leave them vulnerable to other forms of abuse. Such barriers can include institutional cultures of disbelief and indifference and misogyny. The police response to the murders of Biba Henry, Nicole Smallman, and Jan Mustafa demonstrates this most clearly, although in these cases, racism was also a factor. Indeed, in many cases, racism and discrimination can result in what I call the over-policing and criminalization of Black and minority women. To give an example, the myth of African and Caribbean women as fulfilling masculine roles in their own communities is not uncommon amongst the police and other state institutions. Notions of such women as strong, aggressive, or independent and self-reliant often work to the disadvantage of some such women when they find themselves subject to domestic abuse. They're often deemed to have no culture or constraints that would impact on their ability to exit from abuse. Despite evidence that suggests that women from African and Caribbean backgrounds face high levels of domestic abuse, their accounts of abuse or coercion and control are often deemed to be incapable of belief. Any act of retaliation to abuse on their part is often treated as an act of aggression, and as a consequence, many are treated as perpetrators of abuse and so disproportionately criminalized. For instance, in one court case, a judge made frequent references to the fact that the deceased was a slight, small man, he was white, whereas the defendant was a tall Black woman. Much attention was given to reports from family and friends that she had kicked and slapped him and stabbed him with a fork, despite the fact that there was evidence of his repeated abuse and harassment towards her from the police and from her phone. And she had a domestic violence protection order against him and had a panic alarm installed in her home. All of this clearly indicated that her partner was the primary aggressor, not her. Women of African and Caribbean descent are also less likely to be are also likely to be more reluctant to report abuse to the police because of resistance within their communities to the realities of over-policing by other state institutions. Many fear heavy-handed social services intervention in their family life. This is not surprising given that Black children are overrepresented in care homes. In the recent case of Farizia Martin, a young Black working class woman from Liverpool who killed her abusive partner, she hid the abuse even when attending hospital for injuries due to her fear that social services would intervene in the care of her 2 small children. This recurring pattern of over-policing when BME women report abuse therefore raises serious questions and concerns in respect of intersectional discrimination, wider public interests, and human rights abuses. However, the other side of the coin in respect of state and police response is the under-policing of violence against women. In my experience, women from South Asian backgrounds are more likely to experience situations where state agencies refuse to intervene in their family matters because it is assumed that they have their own internal cultural mechanisms for resolving disputes. Such a non-interventionist approach to family matters in minority communities is usually based on a fear of offending religious and cultural sensibilities. But this results in a culturally relativist approach to Asian women, which means that their rights and freedoms take second place to culture. They are in effect delivered back into abusive relationships because powerful community and religious leaders who act as mediators between state and community and who determine when and how the state responds to abuse, even though these so-called leaders are unelected and very rarely act in the interests of women and justice. Most continue to define and promote so-called religious and cultural values that encourage community self-policing, which keeps women subjugated, silent and invisible. Despite decades of Black and minority feminist struggles to force the state to recognize issues such as forced marriage or FGM as abuses of women's human rights, rather than cultural practices to be tolerated, we struggle to hang on to the gains we have made. The rise of religious conservatism and fundamentalism, for example, threatens to take us backwards. Currently, we are witness to the increasing use of religion in many minority communities to keep women silent and powerless and to sustain patriarchal structures. Growing demands for faith schools and the imposition of gender segregation in public spaces and demands for parallel legal systems based on religious precepts and the imposition of strict dress codes are all primarily aimed at controlling women's sexuality and maintaining so-called family values. However, in affirming culture and religious rights as having a place in multicultural society, state law and policy fails to take account of the unequal measure of power minority women exercise, not only within a culture and community, but in determining the ground rules of that culture and religion and community. Another key barrier faced by BME women is a hostile immigration asylum climate deliberately created by this government, and most of us have been following the news lately in relation to this. But what we've seen is that this hostile climate denies women access to migrant women access to the welfare safety net. And this also represents a major barrier for women. I don't really have time to do justice to the numerous ways in which these and many other internal and external barriers intersect to create dangers for Black and minority women and girls. In the time that I've left, I will focus on 2 examples to highlight how lethal spaces of patriarchal violence and control are created and exacerbated by the intersection of these barriers. The first concerns the honor killing of Benaz Mahmood in 2006, and the second concerns the experiences of migrant women. Banaz was a young woman from a Kurdish background who lived with her parents and 4 sisters and a brother in a close-knit environment in which girls in particular were expected to adhere to strict religious and gender roles, including strict dress codes. As a child, Banaz and her sisters suffered abuse and torture at the hands of their father. They were also subject to constant surveillance and considerable control by their father, brothers, and other male members of their community. Unable to tolerate her situation, Banaz's older sister, Bekal, ran away from home as a teenager and remained in hiding, although she tried to keep in contact with her siblings. While still a teenager, Banaz was forced into a marriage, but her husband frequently subjected her to domestic violence and rape. She reported the incidents of violence and rape to the police, but no effective action or investigation into her reports were taken. Banaz eventually left her husband and returned home to her family in the hope that they would support her in obtaining a divorce. Whilst at home, her family and community discovered that she had a boyfriend. Her family did not approve because even though he was from the same ethnic background, sort of same religious background, he wasn't from the same ethnic background. Banaz then began to receive anonymous abusive and threatening calls, which she reported to the police, but she asked them not to take any action at that stage. She merely wanted them to record her complaints in case there were future problems. Around this time, Banaz's sister, Bekal, was lured into a meeting at an isolated location by her brother. Once there, he attacked her with a hammer and told her that their father had instructed him to kill her. Bekal managed to run away and alerted the police, but the police failed to take any action. In the meantime, Banaz's family put pressure on her to return to her husband, but she refused to go back to him. Unknown to Banaz, her father grew increasingly angry with her for disobeying him and for bringing shame on her family. He began plotting to kill her. At her family home on New Year's Eve in 2005, Banaz's father plied her with drink in order to reduce her ability to defend herself as he prepared to strangle her. However, before he could attack her, she managed to run into the back garden and banged on a neighbor's window, which she accidentally broke. Receiving no response, Banaz jumped over the garden fence and ran bleeding and barefooted into a coffee shop where the owner called the police and an ambulance. Banaz told the police that her father was trying to kill her and begged them to contact her boyfriend, fearing that he was also in danger. However, the police response was dismissive. Instead of investigating the incident as one of attempted murder, the police sought to charge her for criminal damage for breaking her neighbor's window. They regarded her behavior as melodramatic, immature, and assumed that she was drunk, or merely seeking attention, or simply rebelling against her parents' cultural values. They did not take her allegations seriously. In the absence of police protection, Banaz had no choice but to return home in the hope that her mother would protect her. She was not aware that her father had held a council of war meeting involving male relatives and members of her community. During the evening of 22nd January 2006, Banaz's boyfriend was approached by 4 men from the community who asked him to go with them to an unknown place, and when he refused, they threatened to kill him and Banaz. On 23rd January 2006, Banaz's boyfriend attended his local police station to report the matter, but no crime report was raised by the police. Banaz's boyfriend was left with no choice but to make a formal complaint about police inaction. On the morning of the 24th of January 2006, Banaz was raped, sexually assaulted and strangled by her father and male relatives from her community, who also threatened to kill her boyfriend. Her body was then bundled into a suitcase and buried. In 2007, Banaz's father and uncle were convicted of her murder, and some months later, the other men who had left the country were extradited to the UK to stand trial. They too were eventually convicted for her murder. The case received high-profile media coverage as an honor killing. However, its real significance was not that it was an honor killing, but the fact that prior to the victim's murder, the police knew about the danger to her life, but failed to act to protect her. What is particularly significant about their response is that it betrays both the processes of under-policing and over-policing that took place at the same time. The police had prior knowledge of the dangers and risks to Bernaz's life from her risk to her life from her perpetrators, who subjected her to honor-based violence. Several opportunities were missed by the police to link the threats made to her life and that of her sister. But they treated Bernaz as an immature adolescent who was perhaps experiencing a bit of the culture clash. They failed to take her reports and that of her boyfriend and her sister Bekal seriously, and instead sought to charge Bernaz with criminal damage when she tried to escape her father's attempts to kill her. A subsequent independent police complaints commission investigation into the catalogue of police failures was critical of the police response and concluded that there were missed opportunities to protect Bernaz. But the officers against whom the allegations of failure were substantiated were only given written warnings or words of advice. This despite the fact the overall police failure to record or investigate Bernaz's allegations of violence and threats to her life was in breach of Article 2, 3, and 8, and 14 of the European Convention of Human Rights, which covers the right to life, the right not to be subject to inhuman and degrading treatment, the right to respect for private and family life, and the right not to be discriminated. You might think that this case is old and that the police and state have come a long way in responding to violence against women. But despite some improvements, the continuing failures that we have seen in recent high-profile cases show that we still have a long way to go. For my next example, I want to highlight how the UK's hostile immigration environment excludes migrant women from protection, rendering them not only invisible, but also dispensable. At least 60% or more of the women that contact Southall Black Sisters have been subject to gender-based violence and have insecure immigration status. Some are dependent on their partners or spouses for their immigration status, whilst others arrive in the UK through other immigration routes. Most are also subject to what's called the no recourse to public funds rule, another central plank of the hostile environment policy. The no recourse rule is a legal restriction imposed by the UK Border Agency on people subject to immigration control, preventing them from accessing most forms of welfare benefits and social housing. Breaching this condition puts a person's current or future right to be in the UK at risk. Precisely because of their lack of immigration status and the operation of the rule, many migrant women remain at risk of the most serious and prolonged forms of abuse and coercive control. Some of the most recurrent experiences that women report include being abandoned, imprisoned in their home with no contact with their own families or the outside world, subject to extreme forms of servitude, neglect, and cruelty, having their documents and valuable possessions taken away from them, and being constantly threatened with violence and deportation if they report abuse to any outside body. Almost all the women tell us that they're too scared to report the abuse because the no recourse rule is used as a weapon of coercion and control, not only by perpetrators, but also by the state. Women find themselves locked in abuse in which violence often escalates and there is no way out. You will see here some of the images of a campaign that we have waged for the last 20 years to abolish the no recourse to public funds rule, particularly for women who are subject to abuse and violence. And we tried to introduce amendments to the Domestic Abuse Act without success earlier this year. What I want to say about this is that what we have seen here and with the hostile immigration environment policy is that there is increased criminalization, detention and surveillance of migrants that is taking place, along with withdrawal of access to key services, welfare services, including schools, hospitals, healthcare, rented housing, and so on. And the whole point is to create a climate of fear. And this is really ironic, given the Windrush scandal that we witnessed, which led in 2020 to the current Home Secretary promising that the Home Office would preside over a, I quote, fair, humane, compassionate, and outward-looking people first approach to immigration. But her promise must be one of the most shortest lived in history, political history, because no sooner was the Windrush Review out, and she wasted no time in rebranding the hostile environment as a compliant environment policy, but it continues to amplify a dystopian them and us vision of nationhood and belonging, built on immigration, anti-immigration rhetoric, laws and policies that cut through convivial civic spaces and foment hostility and violence against migrants and those who defend them. So I'm now coming to the end. What we see here is in February 2020, The Guardian covering a story of a desperate Nigerian woman who was the subject of repeated rape as a child and teenager, who was detained at Yarlswood Detention Centre and then forcibly removed onto a plane by private security officers, despite having obtained a legal order staying her deportation. She was manhandled by 11 security guards who threw her to the floor of the plane and placed a blanket over her head, which made it difficult for her to breathe, and she feared that she was going to die. She tried to resist by fighting back, resulting in minor injuries to some of the guards, for which she was arrested and charged with assault. She was eventually acquitted of all the charges by a magistrate's court, who found her response to the restraint of her to be reasonable in the circumstances. The women's experiences of what most certainly appears to be torture and degrading treatment at the hands of the immigration officers compounded her already fragile mental state, having previously been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and placed on suicide watch. This then is the human consequences of the hostile environment policy and the privatization of immigration enforcement when it intersects with domestic abuse and rape. The incident shows not only how the brutal immigration enforcement machinery is put to work by the state, but also the double whammy of violence experienced by migrant women as a continuum of private and state violence. In conclusion, I know I have to conclude, the many glaring silences and gaps that still endure when it comes to violence against women and girls in law, in policy, in the media, and indeed the wider public discourse means that we cannot know for sure who is doing what to whom when it comes to violence against women and girls. Across the world, we see how the political climate has taken an authoritarian turn, one which reinforces patriarchal power and inequality and threatens to overhaul the very rights and protections that have been won through hard and bitter struggle. In the UK, loud calls to tamper with the Human Rights Act, to bring in ever restrictive immigration laws, to privatize welfare services, to do away with justice, and to clamp down on our very right to dissent and protest, tells us that we need to remain vigilant. Unless we are alert to the cultural and structural ways in which institutions of the family, community, and the state continue to denigrate, subjugate, and divide women, we cannot hope to progress women's human rights. Unless we believe in the freedom of all women, we will not be able to fight off the forces that seek to undo justice. This means paying attention to and learning from the countless courageous struggles for social justice, waged by ordinary women and other marginalized groups around the world in conditions far worse than ours. Despite the many challenges we face, I think above all, we urgently need to find a way to connect with each other and to create a politics of solidarity, because women united can never be defeated. Thank you.